In this video, I'm going to go over some more concepts of polymorphism, particularly as it relates to classes and subclasses and methods. So I'm going to start off by showing you this little scenario that I've created. So I have this public class that I've named parent, okay? And the only thing in here is I have a public method 1, a public method 2, and a public do something, okay? And all these do is just print things out, all right? So if I were to sort of draw out what's happening in memory with this particular parent class, it would look something like this, okay? Where I have my parent class and I have my various methods. So nothing particularly interesting there, okay? Now, suppose that I create a child class, all right? So this child class extends parent, all right? I've added a new method called method 3, and then I have overridden method 1 from the parent class. So just as parent had a public void method 1 right here, okay? You see that in the child class, I also now have a public void method 1, okay? And so if I was to draw what happens when you create an instance of a child in memory, okay, it would look something like this, okay? Remember, when we create a subclass, what's happening in memory is first the parent class is getting created, okay, sort of behind the scenes in memory, and then the child class, okay? And so you'll notice what I've done here is I've crossed out method 1 and I've drawn an arrow from it to this method 1 over here. And that's because, as you'll recall, child overrides method 1. So now I have this method 1 and I don't really have this one anymore, okay? All right, so going back to my scenario, now suppose I create a third class called stepchild. Stepchild also extends the parent class, okay? And I've now created a different method, method 4, which is unique to this stepchild class, okay? And I've now overridden method 2 from the parent class, okay? So whereas child overrode method 1, stepchild overrides method 2, okay? So again, if I were to draw that out in memory, okay, here's what my stepchild class looks like. In memory, I have a parent class that's created with all of its various methods. Notice that these method 1, method 2 do something all match what's in parent, okay? But in this case, because I overrode method 2, I'm going to go ahead and cross that out and draw this arrow down to the method 2, which was overridden here in the stepchild class. And then, of course, I have my method 4, which is unique to stepchild. So the reason why I think it's helpful to draw these things out the way that I did is because now when I'm getting different references to things, it's easy to figure out what happens, okay? So now parent is easy because there's nothing you can really do but create a new parent. But you'll see what we're talking about when we create instances of child and stepchild, okay? So if I go back to the IDE, all right, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new parent, okay? Now, referring back to the parent class, you can see that I have 3 different methods that I can call, method 1, method 2, or do something, you know, and in fact, okay, I can call method 1, I can call method 2, and I can call do something. Okay, and you will see that, no surprise, I can compile those and it says, you know, parent class method 1. So it does exactly what we would expect. Okay, likewise, all right, I can do child, C1 equals new child. Okay, and now is where things get a little bit more interesting. Okay, because child is a subclass of parent, I should be able to call all of the methods that are here inside of parent, right? So I should be able to do C1 dot method 1, C1 dot method 2, C1 dot do something, okay? And I should be able to call any new methods that were defined in child. So in this case, method 3 is a new method that has been written here. So I should be able to also do C1 dot method 3, okay? Now, when I compile this, you notice that it compiles fine, but when I run it, the behavior is going to be a little bit interesting. And now let me, in order to just not get confused here, I'm going to comment out these particular things right here. Okay. And so when I run it, you will see that when I do C1.method1, notice that it's calling child class method1. Okay. Well, now wait. When I did P1.method1, it said parent class method1. All right. And so this goes back to why I'd like to create these diagrams, okay? Is if I go back to my diagram here, you'll see that in the child class, all right, I can call any of these methods in the parent. But because I overrode that method, when I call it, it's actually never going to call this method here in the parent that is defined in the parent class. It's going to call the overridden method in child. Okay, so when I have this child object and I call method 1, it's going to actually execute this method 1 rather than this method 1. Okay, the method 2 was not overridden, so it's going to call the method 2 that was defined in parent. Do something was not overridden, so it's going to call the do something that was written in parent. Method 3 is specific to child, so it's going to call that method 3. And so if we look back at the output, you'll see that C1.method1 calls the method 1 that's defined in the child class. Method 2, it calls the method 2 that was defined in the parent class. Do something was defined in the parent class. And then method 3 was defined only in the child class. Okay? Now, suppose that instead of doing child C1 equals new child, I did parent, and I'll call this pref equals new child. Okay? So now I've done the situation where I'm using this superclass reference, but I'm actually creating an instance of child. Okay? So again, we need to go back to our memory diagram to understand what's going on here, okay? So by doing new child, I've actually created a child object, okay? But I'm only referring to it as a parent, okay? So if I go back to my diagram, all right, I've created a new child. Okay, I've created a new child object, but when I refer to it as a parent, that means I can only execute the methods that are inside this blue square here, okay? So by doing it this way, I can only call method 1, method 2, or do something. If I try to call method 3, for example, it's not going to let me, all right? And then the question becomes, if I do call method 1, is it going to call, because I'm using a parent reference, is it going to call this method 1 or is it going to call this method 1? Okay, so let's go ahead and see what happens. So if I do pref.method1, pref.method2, and pref.doSomething. Okay, and again, I'm going to comment out this stuff so that I don't confuse myself. Okay, if I were to compile this, all right, it compiles just fine. And when I execute it, you'll notice that I get child class method 1, parent class method 2, and parent class do something. Okay, so again, even though I have this child object, because I'm referring to it as a parent, That doesn't change the fact that this is still a child object and I've overridden method 1. So when I do pref.method1, it actually executes the child class's method. So if I go back to my diagram, okay, you'll see that when I have this parent reference, I can only execute the items in this blue box. Method 1 has been overridden. So even though I can only execute these methods, it's still going to call the method 1 that's defined here in child. Method 2, of course, is going to be the same as it is in the parent. Do something is going to be exactly the same as it is in the parent. And if I were to try and call method 3, I would actually get an error, okay? Because I am using a reference to parent here, okay? And so let's go ahead and show that. So if I was to try and do pref.method3, okay, you will see that when I try and compile this, it complains and says, I don't know what method 3 is, okay? Because pref is a reference to a parent, okay? And if we look back at our diagram, parent doesn't know what method 3 is. Parent knows what method 1 is, method 2 is, and do something, but has no idea what method 3 is, and so it cannot make this call, okay? Now the question becomes, well, what if you have a child object here that you're referring to it as a parent. What if instead I want to be able to call method 3, okay? Well, because it's a child object, all right, there is a method 3 that's available to it. You just can't get to it by using a parent reference. So this is where we would do our downcast, where we would turn that parent reference into a child, okay? And so what we would do is we would say child cref equals, and then this is where we do our cast, child pref, okay? So we took this parent reference and we cast it into a child. We were allowed to do that because this pref is actually still a child. Like in memory, there's a child object there. So this cast is legal and it won't error out or complain at us when we try and do this, okay? And so now from here, using this cref, we can call method 3, okay? So again, if I were to compile this, now it doesn't complain at me, okay? And now when I execute this, I get my child class method 3 here at the end, okay? So that is the basics of how you do, I guess, downcasting and how inheritance and methods and things work, particularly when you're overriding methods. Again, I find it very, very helpful to sort of draw out a diagram of what's happening so that I know, like in this case, if I have a parent reference, I can only do these 3 things. But when I do this one, it actually executes this, okay? And likewise, I didn't show this in this example, but if I had created some stepchild instances, okay, if I had done parent p2 equals new stepchild, then again, I would only have access to these parent methods. And if I called method 2, it would still execute this overridden method in the subclass. Okay? So we'll be talking more about this in probably future videos.